Hey everyone, just before we start, one of the biggest channels in this community, Camelworks, has lost access to his channel through a very painful series of events. He has been forced to open up a new channel and could use all the support he can get. So be sure to visit his new channel and give him some support. I linked his new channel in the description. That said, let's get to today's video. Hello YouTube. The history of the Elder Scrolls universe is full of big and momentous occasions and events, from mortals ascending to godhood to wars which destroy literal nations. Now, today I want to talk about an event which was, for all terms and purposes, an event which changed the history of Tamriel forever, the literal destruction of Morrowind in the early 4th era. How did it happen, who were involved, and what was the aftermath? We will talk about all that and more after the intro. So, Morrowind, the province of ashlands and gigantic mushrooms, is by far one of the most popular picks for people's favorite province, and with good reason. But the province was hit by an almost apocalyptic series of events during the early 4th era. First, Vivec city was destroyed, then Tsunamis destroyed much of the coasts, then Red Mountain erupted, and then finally the Argonians invaded and destroyed what was left of much of the province. Yeah. Quite an unfortunate series of events. But to explain how we got to that point, we need to look at this person, the living god Vivec, a favorite study object for many in the lore community. You see, during the events of the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, the living god Vivec had lost both much of his power and most of his prestige as the Nerevarine destroyed Dagoth-Ur and the Heart of Lorkhan, and then fulfilled the prophecy of Azura. This meant an immense change for Dunmer society, as the Dark Elves' society had revolved around the Tribunal's worship for centuries, a tribunal which was now mostly gone and disgraced. The Dunmer people didn't really know what to do with the Tribunal in their society, as Sothasil and Almalexia were gone, and Vivec kind of disgraced in the eyes of many. Now, theological and worship problems aside, there was a much more present and real problem for Morrowind when Vivec was losing much of his power at the tail end of the 3rd era. You see, several centuries earlier, back when the city named after the living god, Vivec City, was being built, Sheogorath, being Sheogorath, threw a meteor, or small oblivion moon as some call it, at the city in an attempt to destroy it before its completion. But this plan to destroy the city failed, as Vivec, then still at the height of his power, just held up his hand and then, using the power that he had as a living god, he stopped the meteor, which was called the Baar Dau, right in its tracks, freezing it in its position above the city, holding it in place there just using his power. Now, you might say, wouldn't it have been more practical to just slowly let it descend and make it have a soft landing in the water instead of freezing it in place right above your city, requiring a constant flow of power from Vivec to stay afloat? You know, just in case you ever, lose your power, as that would mean that this meteor would resume its course and destroy the city anyway. Because crucially, Vivec froze the meteor in such a way that the meteor's velocity, so its speed, was retained, but just frozen in place, meaning that if it ever got unfrozen, it would not fall slowly as if it just got dropped, but immediately resume its devastating fall at the same speed that it had just before it was stopped. So it may have been more practical to just slow it down a bit, but no, Vivec froze it like that as a bit of a symbol and a message to the people of Morrowind, a symbol that, yes, he is their protector and by his grace they will not be destroyed by a meteor, but also as a bit of a threat that if they ever stopped worshipping him, he would just drop the Baar Dau on top of them. A pretty convenient way to stay in power, not gonna lie. But it was also a pretty bad thing for the people of Morrowind, as by the early 4th era not only had Vivec lost most of his power, he also just straight up disappeared, with no one knowing where he went. This meant that from that moment on, Vivec's power on the meteor started to wane fast, and if left alone, the meteor would just resume its course and fall on the city and destroy it. Well, not really fall on the city, but more like crash into the city. And so, some of the brightest and most powerful mages of Morrowind convened at Vivec city, and under the leadership of a man named Vuhon, they constructed an apparatus called the Ingenium. A magical device which could take the souls of mortals and somehow convert them into energy to keep the Baar Dau afloat. The way that the device did this, as we covered in my video from last week on the Elder Scrolls novels, where the Ingenium plays a pretty significant role, was that it took the souls of mortals that were sacrificed to the machine, and then it opened a sort of pathway or soul tunnel to the Oblivion realm of the Daedric Prince Clavicus Vile, the Daedric Prince of Bargains. By sending souls into his realm, they were able to siphon off a ton of Daedric power from his realm, enough to keep the Baar Dau afloat. Now, one of the designers of the Ingenium theorized that either the head designer Vuon had struck a deal with Clavicus Vile, or Clavicus Vile was so happy with the flow of souls that he didn't really care about the power that was being siphoned off. Anyway, this Ingenium, as you can imagine, used a lot of mortal souls, and their strategy at first was simply to use the souls of criminals and slaves to feed the machine, killing many of them every day to feed their souls into the Ingenium. But as you can imagine, there are only so many prisoners and slaves, and after some time they quickly started to run out of people to sacrifice, at least people they could sacrifice without too much consequence. Now, at this point, the head designer Vuon managed to find a way to take a very specific, powerful mortal soul and have the Ingenium powered by that kind of soul for a longer period of time. So instead of many regular people being sacrificed every week, it would just be one or two every so often. Now, this type of soul that they needed isn't really specified, but it was a type of soul which was rare, but some Dunmer did possess it. And the people that they selected to slowly feed the machine off their more powerful than regular souls, they seemingly did not really go willingly, but with the argument of sacrificing the few for the many, this new system of taking people with these kind of souls came in place, and everything seemed to work. But still, as I said in my other video, this was a pretty cruel system, and I would say it likely wouldn't be viable for the long term anyway. So I think the best thing that they could have done at this point, which some commenters on the last video suggested, is to go to the Baar Dau and slowly mine it into smaller pieces and then bring these smaller pieces to the ground, something which was possible as in the Third Era the meteor was mined out to house the Ministry of Truth. So they could have just, taken small pieces and bring them to the surface, and then eventually the meteor would be gone. Why they didn't do that and instead tried to keep the meteor afloat as it was, we have no idea. But it would be their ultimate downfall, as in the year 5 of the 4th era the system of sacrifices fell apart when the designer Vuon selected the wife of another designer of the Ingenium to be sacrificed. This other designer, Sul, then went into a rage and freed his wife, preventing her sacrifice, while Vuon tried to fight him in order to prevent him from freeing her. Their fight took place in the chamber of the Ingenium and resulted in the Ingenium being damaged in the fight and then destroyed in an explosion, which was caused by the fight. This explosion sucked both Vuon and Sul into oblivion and set off the events of the Elder Scrolls novels. My video on those is in the description in case you want to hear that full story. But in this video, instead of following them into oblivion, we stay on Tamriel, where after the Ingenium exploded, the Baar Dau instantly resumed its course towards Tamriel. This rock went from a speed of 0 to multiple times the speed of sound, the original speed that it had when originally falling towards the city. This all happened within a second, and in the blink of an eye, Vivec city was completely destroyed, and a massive fire-filled crater appeared where the Baar Dau had made contact, in the middle of the city. Everyone and everything in Vivec city was destroyed by the immense impact. Quickly water would flow in from the inner sea to the crater, creating a place called the Scathing Bay in the place where Vivec city used to be. But this was not the end. Oh no, this impact would be the start shot of a year of natural and military disasters for the Dunmer people, which would come to be known as the Red Year. As mere seconds after the impact, the sheer force of the meteor caused for earthquakes all across Morrowind and eastern Skyrim, with the earthquakes going as far as the city of Tyr, all the way over here. The earthquakes did their most damage, however, in the cities and towns on Vvardenfell. But, Vvardenfell's center is this massive active volcano, the Red Mountain. And due to the massive impact of the meteor and the subsequent earthquakes, the unstable earth under the volcano started to become more and more active. And after a short while, the volcano became more active as well. And then, on the 3rd day of the month Sun's Dawn in the years 5 of the 4th era, the mountain erupted. And it was the worst eruption of Red Mountain since the early First Era. The cities on Vvardenfell that were still left standing after the earthquakes were destroyed by walls of lava and ash, and the sun was blotted out by ash, and even mainland Morrowind got covered in ash for a long while. The ash that was apparently everywhere in the air made it so that the sun could only illuminate the sky in a faint red glow, hence the name of this disastrous year being the Red Year. We see this depiction of the Red Year in the Elder Scrolls Legends, and as you can see, the entire sky is completely red. In this year, harvests failed, ecosystems were destroyed due to the lack of sunlight and massive amounts of ash. Species went nearly extinct. It was a cataclysmic ecological disaster. But wait, there's more, because you see, the fact that a rock crashed into Morrowind with the speed of Mach fuck, specifically crashing into Vivec City, a large water-based city, meant that shockwaves went throughout the water as well, shockwaves which were amplified by the earthquakes and were as such felt throughout the seas and oceans all around Tamriel, resulting in tsunamis crashing into the coasts of all of Tamriel. While the worst came to Morrowind and northern Skyrim, with the biggest tsunamis hitting there, even the Summerset Isles were apparently hit by massive tsunami-like waves due to the massive shockwaves growing throughout the planet's water. Much of the coasts were destroyed by water, much of the mainland was covered in ash and going without much of actual sunlight, and Vvardenfell was all but destroyed by walls of hot lava. Only House Redoran of the Dunmer had been spared much of the destruction and dedicated itself to helping the rest of the province at this time. But wait, there's even more. Because not long after the eruption, the Argonians from the south were standing at the border, under the leadership of their nationalist government, the Anselil. Now, the Argonians since time immemorial had been enslaved by the Dark Elves and driven from many parts of southern Morrowind, which were swampy, for the Dark Elves to then settle there. Sometimes the Dark Elves would straight up invade northern Blackmarsh just to capture Argonians to use them as slaves. And now, yet less than a year after the eruption of the Red Mountain, the Argonians of northern Blackmarsh saw how the Dark Elves were severely weakened due to these many disasters, and they then decided to use that weakness by sending hordes of Argonians over the border to raid Morrowind as a revenge for the centuries of enslavement, destroying whatever was left standing of much of southern Morrowind after the ash storms. The Argonian war parties came very far, with some of them even reaching the ruins of Vivec City, and the war would come to be known as the Accession War, but ultimately they were stopped by the one Dunmer Great House which had been more or less spared of much of the bad effects of the disasters, House Redoran, who sent its armies to aid the other Dark Elves and drive the Argonians back south. Now, from the novels we learned that the Argonians did take the swampy parts of southern Morrowind and actually permanently settled in them after having driven off the Dark Elves, but the Dark Elves under House Redoran managed to at least drive them from much of the Ashlands and back into the swamps. After this point, House Redoran would become the biggest voice on Morrowind's Grand Council, as it was them who helped rebuild much of Morrowind and drove much of the Argonians out. And Morrowind would be restored somewhat, although not to the heights that it had once been, as decades later there would still be a lot of hardship and poverty. Thousands had fled Morrowind during the Red Year, fleeing as refugees to Skyrim and Solstheim, and many of them died, and almost everything in Morrowind was straight up destroyed by all these events. While these disasters were going on, the Empire was also falling apart quickly and thus couldn't offer much help, especially after Okato was assassinated and the Empire descended into infighting over leadership and basically wasn't able to do anything to help the provinces, with only House Redoran of Morrowind having the resources to somewhat help the rest of the province. We know that over the course of the subsequent 200 years leading up to Skyrim, at least Balmora on the island of Vvardenfell has been rebuilt on top of the ash and the lava, as were many other cities on the mainland, but even 200 years later Morrowind is still relatively poor and some cities, like apparently Mournhold, are still trying to rebuild 200 years later. It was a disaster on an unprecedented scale and by far the worst thing to happen to the Dunmer people. And part of me really wants to have a game set in this sort of post-apocalyptic Morrowind, a Fallout Morrowind so to say, set in like the year 10 of the 4th era, only just after the Argonians had mostly been driven out and when almost everything was still destroyed. But hey, the chance that we get that is pretty small, so but a guy can dream. That being said, that's about all I can say about this subject, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video and that I managed to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today. And if I did, why not give the video a like or one of those new hype boosts or whatever that is that YouTube cooked up. Would be very much appreciated, as those are the ways to let the YouTube algorithm know that this video is worthy. And with that said, it's time to thank my top Patreon supporters: Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, King Chris 20, Steve G, Volcure of Argonia, RB Dash, His Soul, Lexicon, Ranger, Komodo, Rakai, and Sorta Bushido. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen, so my YouTube members and my Patreon subscribers, that this channel stays afloat, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I will see all of you in the next lore video. Bye bye.